Alrighty, it's 2:03, so I'm going to go ahead and get this show on the road. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome in. My name is Rachel Pertel, and I am a research associate at the National Communication Association. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's public program titled The Power of Dissent, Best Practices for Advocacy Within Organizations. Today's event is part of NCA's broader effort to foster dialogue, promote diversity, and provide expert insights into important topics that impact communication practices and scholarship. Through our public programs, we aim to engage a wide audience from students to professionals in discussions that not only highlight key research, but also encourage best practices in and beyond the field. After a brief hiatus, we're very excited to resume our long-standing public programming schedule, now offering virtual events. And I'm especially excited to be here with you all as we dive into the critical issue of dissent in organizational settings. Before we dive in, though, I do want to read a brief land acknowledgement, and this can also be found on our website at netcom.org. NCA would like to acknowledge the land the national office in Washington, D.C. resides on is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Nechontuk and Piscataway people. NCA acknowledges that it is often gathered upon unceded lands and that those gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism has brought to these lands, in particular, the erasure of both indigenous and African identities via slavery and via racist laws that segregated all peoples into binary classifications of white and Black. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Thank you. We have an excellent lineup of speakers today who will be sharing their research and perspectives with us. Our first presentation, an overview of organizational dissent, will be delivered by Ryan Beisel from the University of Oklahoma. Stephen Croucher also was originally supposed to be part of this presentation from Massey University, but unfortunately, Dr. Croucher fell under the weather and is unable to join us today. But I did want to acknowledge all the awesome work that he's done and that he's a great part of our team. Next, Chen Zheng from North Dakota State University and Stephanie Kelly from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University will present on why supervisors need to think about dissent. Finally, we will hear from Catherine Armstrong of Missouri Valley College, Michael Solito of Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi, and Carrie Leffler of Baylor University on realizing if, when, and how to express dissent, practical advice for expressing dissent. And that last presentation will also include a helpful reflection that you can all put into practice when you encounter a situation in your own workplace that might motivate you to express dissent. I'll be moderating today's program and helping field questions at the end, so please feel free to drop in any questions in the chat that might come to mind during presentations, or feel free to save them toward the end, for the end and use Zoom's raise hand feature when prompted. So without further ado, let's get started. Ryan, please go ahead and take us away.
Great. Can you all hear me? Give me a nod if you can hear me. Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon to you. I'm Dr. Ryan Beisel, and it falls to me to give us a quick overview of organizational dissent research, which I'm looking forward to getting to do. And I think maybe a nice place to start is to make the point that I might be a little biased, but dissent is a quintessential organizational communication topic because it shows us what happens when both tasks and relationships really, really matter. And the amazing thing about studying dissent is it gives us a chance to think about how flows of communication makes organizations what they are. And it speaks to the very essence of how organizations are constituted by communication. Before we go too much farther, I think that it's an important point to say up front that when we talk about dissent, we don't necessarily assume dissent is right or wrong, or always right or always wrong. Because really dissent has more to do with disagreement. And so you'd have to know a lot more of the details in order to know who's right, who's wrong, or whether or not something does need to be changed or whether it doesn't, that kind of thing. So that's an important caveat as we move forward. If we could advance the slide, that'd be helpful. And we'll get ourselves a very specific definition, comes to us from Jeffrey Cassing at ASU. Dr. Cassing is a pioneer, the pioneer of this field of organizational dissent, and we are grateful for the work that he's laid down. He gives the definition of organizational dissent as expressing disagreement or contradictory opinions about organizational policies, practices, and operations. And so we see that disagreement, contradictory opinions are key. Now, very often when we think about dissent, we tend to think of it as upward dissent, that there's a power imbalance and that somebody without power is speaking to somebody with more power, a disagreement or so forth. And that is absolutely part of this literature, an important part, and a lot of what we will be talking about. But it's important to note that disagreements can really happen in other directions as well. They can happen laterally among coworkers who don't necessarily have authority over one another. In terms of a command structure, it can also happen downwards. Dissent can happen downwards in terms of somebody who has more power to somebody who has less. I'd also give you the term displaced dissent. It's a fascinating point that sometimes disagreements and contradictory opinions get displaced outside of the organization altogether, oftentimes to family and friends. And some early work shows us, for example, that hauntingly, it's concerns about ethics with policies, practices, operations that unfortunately get displaced outside of the organization and told to family and friends and so forth. So that's a clear definition of dissent as we move forward. It's important to also say, I think, as we talk about what is dissent and what isn't it, it's not necessarily synonymous, though it's definitely often overlapping with things like employee resistance and whistleblowing and upward influence. Whereas resistance might be a little less direct. It might have sort of a different connotation, you might say, than dissent, where we're really talking about expressions, overt expressions of disagreements and opinions. Whistleblowing tends to really be about reporting to external agencies. Something that's going on tends to be associated with ethical problems, and upward influence is like managing your manager, that kind of thing. Now, importantly, organizational dissent can have to do with ethics, but often doesn't. It can have to do with just a contradictory opinion about how we're doing what we're doing and so forth. So it is important to lay out that framework and know, what it is we're talking about and what we aren't talking about necessarily. So if we could advance a slide, that would be helpful. Great. Always important to talk about why communication matters, and it certainly does. Dissent matters in the workplace for lots of reasons and on lots of levels. It matters for and to members. It matters to organizations largely, and of course, it matters to society as well. As we talk about dissent, with managers and leaders, it's an important thing to get to say, like, look, you should care about the free flow of dissent because this is ultimately good for members in the sense that it's going to improve their commitment, loyalty, and identification. And that makes good sense because if people feel like they can freely disagree and voice their contradictory opinion, that's going to help them have a sense that they have ownership in this place, in the work that we're doing. And that will drive, of course, dynamics of belongingness and attachment that commitment, loyalty, and identification connect with. Of course, it's going to help them feel more satisfied in their job, especially if they can, in expressing contradictory opinions or disagreements, they can get some of the things that demotivate them most changed. If they can do that, then that's going to improve their satisfaction. And then broadly, it helps with performance. We sometimes are reluctant to talk about performance, I think, in organizational communication directly, in part because this is actually quite difficult to study. But I think given data, given theory, it makes good sense to say dissent can improve at least performance of teams and higher level systems because it can be a mechanism through which we, of course, gather good ideas. And people have great ideas, not that all ideas are created equal, but they have good ideas and they have a better view of what's going on and what needs to be adapted. And so when they can voice that and we can make changes, it's going to help performance in that sense. And that ties very, very nicely to why dissent matters to organizations. Dissent matters to organizations. I really love this phrase taken from Wyke and Sutcliffe, is that it's a way to catch trouble while it's still small and resolvable. If we have a lot of trust and free-flowing dissent, that means that people can tell us what what problems there are so that we can do something about them. When there's pervasive silence and a lack of dissent going on, that means otherwise smaller problems, they grow and manifest, and they become not small and resolvable, but large and intractable. They get so big before we do anything about them that we can no longer do anything about them. And so dissent is a really important topic for top level decision makers in this sense as well. And like we've already kind of hinted at, it improves decision quality when we get more voices, more perspectives with different lived experiences invested and contributing to our decision making. That is going to feed forward into a requisite variety that we need to make better decisions, be more fit with the environment, survive and thrive. And then ultimately, we have to say that dissent matters for all of society larger. It is a safeguard against wrongdoing. I think it's very insightful for us as communication scholars to look back at a paper in 1985 by Charles Redding, the great organizational communication scholar Charles Redding, who wrote one of the main things we can do in our classes is teach people to be better dissenters within their organizations, because in essence, that helps all of us in society not be as harmed by organizations behaving badly, because they do. We know organizational wrongdoing and malfeasance and so forth is all too common, and it hurts members, and it hurts stakeholders, and it hurts society. So it is a powerful point there to say as well that, of course, dissent matters on lots of levels. So if you could step forward, please. Last slide. The question becomes, what are the factors that constrain dissent? I'm sure all of you are already imagining lots of factors that do, and that's true. There are many reasons why the free flow of disagreements don't happen. The fact of the matter is, the potential hurt feelings or embarrassment around power holders is a big deal, and it is going to constrain the free flow of dissent. A couple of important factors that come up time and time again. First one would be power distance, and this can be actually associated with national cultures, high power distance cultures, and so forth. I tend to think of Japan, for example, because of many historical reasons. I understand that in that country, that a disagreement with power holders, it has an escalated sense of face threat in those kinds of nations, and I'm sure some other scholars on the call can speak to that even with greater detail than I can. So yes, there's power distance is going to only exacerbate the potential risks involved with voicing disagreement with power holders if we're talking about upward dissent. And then, there's also some local cultural elements, and I mean local in kind of several ways, even within the organization. One interesting thing that sometimes happens with power distance that's kind of counterintuitive is that when you think about flattened hierarchies, especially we're in an age of flattening hierarchies where there's fewer and fewer rungs between entry or frontline workers and top level decision makers. Weirdly enough, sometimes as organizations flatten, there's a perception of greater power distance between each rung because it's such few chains of nodes in the chains of command on the way up. And that can, strangely enough, exacerbate fears that people have of embarrassing power holders and so forth. There are so many cultural influences associated with dissent and why people hold back. I'll just give you a couple. There is, unfortunately, a kind of long-standing belief comes from, I think, classical management theory that basically assumes that if this is our hierarchy, it assumes that really there's a few thinkers up top and everybody else should be a doer. It's that cultural assumption that there's thinkers versus doers. As opposed to, I think, a healthier one that's maybe more aligned with a human resource philosophy. It says everyone should be a thinker, everyone should be a doer, because we have these great brains and they can offer innovative ideas, problem solving, and creativity, and so forth. And also, there's a lot to be learned by doing, and that thinking while doing is a really powerful point there. I think there's cultural influences and assumptions around romance of leadership. Sometimes we mythologize leaders too much, or we say there's some recent research by Dr. Elena Zanin at ASU that says we tend to hold different co-production beliefs about who's really ultimately responsible for organizational accomplishments and task accomplishment. And if we have the cultural assumption that it really is why it's the team's job as opposed to the leader's job, that's going to change how much we feel like we can dissent freely. You have the point here, number 3 point, that fear is a huge part of what constrains dissent. In fact, maybe it all comes down to fear on some level. It seems like the research shows us about 70 or 80% of the time when people say that they held back, they will say it's because I was concerned about a retribution of some kind. And that has to do with even being like labeled or viewed negatively. And it makes sense that people say, if I speak up with an opinion that's contradictory, maybe I won't be as liked as much. And there's a deep fear that that's going to show up on, let's say, performance evaluations, that there will be a diminishment of their performance evaluations, which often is tied to compensation, which is sometimes tied to promotions. And so people have the sense, right, wrong, or otherwise, that if they disagree in dissent, it could really come to haunt them. And so in that sense, often dissent is a very reasoned out communication event where people do think it through and they weigh the costs and benefits as they move forward. There's also, of course, a lot of internal organizational factors of the silencing power of power. Fear around being seen as unintelligent if my disagreement's wrong, if I'm not smart or I'm not incompetent, if maybe I'll be viewed as a troublemaker or naive. There's lots of fears associated with that. In terms of internal organizational factors, let me just give you a quick couple. Like one, if the organization is doing tasks that leave almost no time for deliberation because it's so urgent and pressing, well, that's going to limit just logistically in terms of time whether or not dissent can come to the fore. I think also there's a status quo bias in organizations for all kinds of reasons, a status quo bias. And so if that's the way we've always done it, we're going to be a bit more resistant to dissent, and people read that. They read that and internalize that status quo bias. You know, also, I think when there's precarious job security, when there's economic downturn, when there's extreme competition environments, as there are in some kinds of work, then that fear, that kind of cost benefit analysis can be quite out of whack and can militate, I think, against the open and free, candid expression of dissent. If you would move the slide forward, please. So I know I only have about 4 or 5 more minutes and just a couple slides before I hand it off. It is important for us to talk through that there are known upward dissent strategies. I know that that's part of our conversation today, how to do this. Once again, Jeffrey Cassing has done tremendous work here and actually has a measure, validated measure to be used. Cassing and Kava as well in 2013 are very good on this as well. And they find that there's kind of 4 main strategies that people use to dissent. 4 main strategies. So the first one would just be like a pro-social strategy. This is raising concerns openly, actively, and you might say constructively. This is pro-social here doesn't necessarily mean ethical. It really means polite, like it's not necessarily pro-societal, it's pro-social, meaning polite and using a lot of communication competence, perhaps asking questions, directing people's attention to the point of concern or debate. And so it's about raising concerns openly. Then there's a repetition strategy where the dissent or disagreement just gets raised often. Then we have a circumvention. As you know, this is expressing dissent to someone higher in the hierarchy, maybe going around the direct manager, the direct supervisor to the boss's boss. And then there's threatening resignation, giving an ultimatum that if that issue isn't resolved, there will be an exit, there will be quitting, that kind of thing. And so one of the things we have learned about these strategies, especially in light of the very helpful measure that goes along with these, is that they tend to be perceived widely by people as organized on a continuum of communication skillfulness or competence. I look to the work of Johnny Garner at TCU, who's done great stuff with this. And as you might guess, that people tend to think that pro-social and repetition strategies are more skillful than circumvention and threatening resignation. There's kind of a heightening sense of threat or face threat that goes as we go down the ladder. And that is not to say that we should never circumvent or threaten resignation. That is because if presumably the right issue might certainly mean a very effortful, tactical approach that could include any of these strategies. But by and large, in terms of just on the face of it, all things being equal, we see that there tends to be a stronger preference or assumption of communication skillfulness for things like prosocial repetition, circumvention, threatening resignation, for those first two rather than those last two. And something that Cassing has made the point is that very often, especially if they're large issues that are being dissented about, and it's over time, you might see people actually move down that ladder a little bit, as if they attempt to start with prosocial and don't get a sense of satisfaction and change, they might keep repeating. Once if that doesn't happen, it might move to circumvention, if that does, that kind of thing. And I think that makes good sense. So, and if we would step forward one more. Now that we've talked about clear definition of dissent, we talked about what are some factors that constrain dissent? Why is it not free flowing? What are the strategies that people are using? It's also really important to talk about it from the other direction, not just what are the things members can do to dissent, but we need to also talk about what are the things full social systems, organizations, teams can do to improve the free flow of candid and frank, authentic conversations that they need to have in order to keep trouble small while still resolvable. And here, trust is going to be really big. Trust is going to be just a perennial topic that comes up in many different flavors. When we trust each other, that we can take interpersonal risks by disagreeing and know that retribution won't, befall us, then that's going to be an environment where you see dissent flow and flow well. Psychological safety, of course, by Amy Edmondson. This is great. There's some great measures out there of psychological safety in teams. And that really has to do with the sense that I can take an interpersonal risk and I can say something that might hurt your feelings or embarrass you or me, but that it'll be okay. And when we have that sense, you tend to get much better dissent going on. Important point here too is, and I think very related, is when there's a culture that values learning and not perfection. There's a great book out recently by Dr. Mary Murphy on cultures of growth, and she takes the growth mindset, fixed mindset into organizational cultures, and it's very instructive, terrific work. I commend it to you. But a key insight here is that when whole organizations, especially top level decision makers, they value improvement and growth and learning more than everybody being perfect performers the first time, that's going to also engender a culture where people feel like they trust each other and can take a risk and can either admit mistakes or can discuss frankly mistakes made by others, and that's going to help. Dr. Cassing, Jeff Cassing gives us the point that we need to invite disagreement, like managers, leaders, organizational decision makers need to make it a norm that we invite disagreement. And that sounds like having enough time to say, okay, where might we be getting it wrong? What's weak here? What's risky? If something didn't go right for us that day, what would it have been? And normalizing that kind of solicitation of disagreement or just explicit discussions of where we might be weak and what we might need to do to improve. I love Cassing's encouragement too to make a norm of scrutinizing positive feedback. If there's too much, yes man or yes womaning or this kind of brown nosing or sucking up, that needs to be held accountable as well as anything, because there needs to be a sense in which everything is in need of improvement and everything has that's something that we can talk about and get better on. So also an encouragement to tell positive stories of dissenters. And people learn our culture is based essentially in story and narrative. And I think that's powerful. Cassing gives us a great example of an organization that used the metaphor of guardian angel status, which I think is neat. That in this organization, it's one where if you spoke up with a contradictory opinion or disagreement, that you would essentially obtain in that organization guardian angel status, and people would sometimes invoke that or bring it up or even award that. And a fascinating way in order for organizations to say, this is what we want. We want people who will feel free to disagree. Of course, critical advisors, these are strategies against groupthink, are always, they're adjacent, essentially, strategies, organizational strategies for encouraging dissent. Assigning red teams, this would be like if you had a multi-team approach to planning or product development or something like that. assigning one of those teams is basically there to explore what could go wrong, or what's risky, what's weak. And that can be a great way of essentially assigning the task or assigning the role of being dissenter. And that can help people, because if that's the role that they were assigned, that's the job they were assigned by decision makers, it lets them off the hook a little bit in terms of their fear of embarrassing others, because in fact that's what they're doing their job. Jester is the point that having humor can be a great way where people feel more comfortable speaking truth to power, and welcoming appropriate humor and comedy can really be an interesting insight and avenue through which dissent can flow more freely. And then we have immediacy. Immediacy, of course, just means behaviors that improve our sense of psychological closeness and nearness. And some great work by Dr. Croucher, who wishes he could be here, I'm sure, is and others on the panel have shown that, yeah, when bosses are known for being people who know about us, who smile and who are welcoming and approachable, those immediacy behaviors really then build the trust needed in order to solicit the free flow of dissent. And so with that, I think that comes to the end of my portion. I get the great privilege of throwing it over to Dr. Zhang and Dr. Kelly.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Chen Zhen from North Dakota State. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Beisel, for covering some of the most important concepts in dissent. Now, I and Dr. Callan, we're talking about why supervisors need to think about dissent. I think, especially for my part, I would just double down the importance of dissent. I think Dr. Beisel was talking about why dissent matters. And I think it's kind of the same when we're talking about organizations, the management. I think nowadays managers are going to say, yes, we do value employee voice. We do value employee dissent. No one's going to say, yeah, no, we're not listening. But I just don't think they care enough. And I don't think they understand the importance of dissent. This is what my portion is going to be about. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Why dissent matters is because I believe there's a fundamental perception gap between managers and frontline employees. Is because they have different roles, especially for managers who don't work on the front line. They don't get their hands dirty. They don't understand the work done on the ground. So they may have different expectations, different priorities, their risk assessment and understanding, or they could be more sometimes over-optimistic about how things are in the workplace. And this is also evident in the workplace stats. If you look at how many events, especially negative events, workplace injuries, and often go unreported. And it was very interesting because a couple of weeks ago, I was filling out the baseline safety training. I'm sure a lot of professors in the room are doing it every year. Is employees are required to fill out a near accident report. And I was filling it out. I was thinking to myself, would I do it? Probably not, because it never happened. No damage was done. Why would I bother and spend more time actually working on this? So it is managers don't get to hear about these stories, and automatically I think they have generally speaking, over optimistic perception about the workplace. I think dissent here serves as a reality check. Just brings the managers, especially those decision makers, back to the ground, help them understand what are things happening here. Move to the next slide, please. Thank you. In recent years, I'm starting to dip my toes in the area that's called risk and crisis communication, and I'm seeing a strong connection between dissent and the risk and crisis comm. And here we're seeing there are two types of risks that have severe consequences on organizational lives. For one, we're talking about black swan events. I'm pretty sure you've heard about this term before. It's about the risks that are really difficult to foresee and prepare for. Those things never happened before, so we didn't know it was coming. And so COVID actually being one example we just lived through. And but black swan problems are not that common because they're rare, right? We don't see black swans every day. But what we're seeing more commonly, what is called by the author Michelle Walker, the great rhino problems. So those problems are visible. They have a high impact, but they are often ignored. So here is really that rhino in the room that you don't want to address. And again, I think Dr. Baizo touched on this, is all the smaller mistakes accumulating, they're not being addressed, and then they escalate into crisis. Here exactly is that. So those risks are just, managers will say, yes, I see that, but I will address it when we have time. We will accommodate employee dissent when it's convenient for us. So this is where they don't necessarily unaware of the problems, but they're just reluctant to take actions. And some of them more in everyday life. My favorite analogy is talking about brushing your teeth, right? Is that it's important, it's highly visible, you have high impact. If you don't brush your teeth, what's going to happen, right? And the worst part, I think, to incentivize management to take actions is you don't get a lot of satisfaction after brushing your teeth, right? It's just something you do on a daily basis. You don't get a lot of that adrenaline or dopamine release when you do it, but it's very important. So I think why this is also, again, looking back to that dissent education, help the management understand why it's important to address dissent before it's too late. And if you look at the most of organizational crises, you realize they are all caused by great rhino problems. The problems have been identified, the dissenters have brought forward. And from a crisis comm perspective, if such crises are happening, and it's really hard to have the employees on your side because they feel, oh, I've told you about the problems, I've warned you, and now you want me to be on your side to recover? I guess I'm not in that 100% at least. So this is where it's very important for organizations to address these problems, to invite employees to address the rhino in the room, so to speak. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, here, when I'm thinking about how dissent can foster a positive loop when it comes to risk mitigation, is when dissent is well accommodated, dissenters are welcome to speak, and then it leads to risk mitigation, and that will help build the crisis resilience and capacity. So in a way, we cannot fully prepare for black swan events. You don't have that kind of information. It's impossible to include that in your risk model because you don't know what you don't know. But it is okay to have that crisis resilience and capacity. And that it's more like you're a healthy human being, that viruses where that kind of illness can't get you, or even they do get you, you can recover very quickly. On the other hand, if you've already experienced a lot of chronic illnesses, and another small virus can take you down. So it's kind of building that crisis resilience and capacity for organizations is very important. Of course, working in a workplace that is crisis resilient, and you're strong, you have a strong plan moving forward, employees tend to probably have higher physical, emotional security, and that they feel, I feel safe here. I think, again, the engagement level, the loyalty level, everything will be higher. That will have the chance to lead to more dissent. The next slide, please. And when dissent is not well accommodated, and this is where we have studies on this before showing that, especially when it comes to ethical issues, mishandled dissenters tend to go blow the whistle to the public. And if you look at every whistleblower, they were all dissenters once in their organizations. And multiple times. It's because their voice was ignored, was dismissed, was sometimes penalized, and that's why they had to blow the whistle. So again, dissent offers tons of opportunities to think about to address all these problems internally. You don't want these to be exposed to the public. And dissent offers you an opportunity to wash your laundry indoors. So you don't want the public to know about it. And when that hits, it's already too late. But of course, I'm sure that the third team will have tons of practical tips on how to encourage dissent, accommodate dissent. But another key issue here is also about the leaders' integrity, right? If you have leaders that have really positive characteristics in many ways, they're fair, they're just, they treat people well, and you're more likely to express your dissent to those type of managers. And with that, I will hand to Dr. Calloway to talk more about the managers' characteristics.
All right, thank you, friend. Could we switch over? Thank you. So hopefully at this point, we've been able to convey that upward dissent to management is a good thing. Yes, sometimes dissent can be uncomfortable to hear when it's not handled in a pro-social manner, but it's so critical for the health of an organization. So let's talk about how supervisors can encourage upward dissent through their communicative behaviors. Now, something that all the communication scholars in this session know is that we as a field have a hard time agreeing about how we define communication or the best methodologies for studying communication. But what we can agree about is that people don't respond to what you say. They respond to what they think you said. And this is really important to remember when we're talking about dissent, that people are not responding to the literal messages, but rather their perceptions or feelings about the message. There are 3 psycho-emotional variables that we know filter supervisors' messages when subordinates are interpreting them in such a way that it affects their willingness to engage in upward dissent later. Now, the first 2 Ryan talked about earlier. One is trust. Subordinates interpret their supervisor's messages through a lens of how trustworthy they believe their supervisor is. Subordinates who have greater trust in their supervisor are more likely to speak up when they feel a need to. Second, perceived immediacy. Now, perceived immediacy is this jargony term that means exactly what Ryan said earlier, how close you feel you are to another person. The closer a subordinate feels their supervisor, the more likely they are to engage in upward dissent when they feel a need. And the third we haven't touched on yet, and that's burnout. Now, unfortunately, I think more of us have developed an innate sense of what it means to be burnout in these last few years than ever before. But burnout is a form of emotional exhaustion, and work can be a strong contributor to burnout. The more burnout a subordinate feels, the less likely they are to engage in upward dissent. So at the end of the day, to foster dissent, supervisors need to come across as trustworthy and warm and combat burnout to their subordinates. And while this is all well and good, you could have probably guessed that based on what you've already heard from Chang and Ryan. And I'm sure that no one was actually striving for the opposite of those goals. So, yes. So at the end of the day, what we need is a toolkit, some behaviors that managers can practice that's likely to help them be perceived as more trustworthy, to help them come across as more immediate, and to help them lower subordinates' burnout. These best practices for communication are going to indirectly influence the likelihood that subordinates will engage in their dissent with managers. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the first is solidarity. Solidarity is a communication construct that comes from the interpersonal communication literature, and it involves communication, any communicative messages that develop understanding and synchronicity between communicators. And I know that's a little abstract. I want you to think for just a moment about the last time you were sitting in a workplace meeting and you intentionally made eye contact with your workplace bestie just to establish that you were both on the same page. You were thinking the exact same thing in that moment. When that happened, you were demonstrating to each other that you had engaged in solidarity messages because you knew that you were on the same page. Solidarity comes from those messages that share opinions about workplace matters or matters outside the workplace that establish that communicators share a perspective. It's also communication that establishes similar backgrounds, similar faiths, or other life experiences that shape those perspectives. So it's messages that lead you to believe that the other person gets you. Now, not all supervisors are going to be comfortable engaging in that type of interpersonal communication with people who work for them. That's okay. Every manager has to develop their own style. But we have to remember that employees are less likely to engage in dissent with managers who are not willing to have those interpersonal conversations to make sure they get that there are times that you're going to be on the same page. And so there are other methods of tailoring communication to support dissent that become even more important. So next slide, please. One of those toolkits of other behaviors is the immediate behaviors, which Ryan mentioned earlier. So Nonverbal immediate behaviors are a set of behaviors that communication researchers borrowed from psychology in the 1970s to better understand how behaviors affect perceived immediacy or psychological closeness. There's a well-established set of nonverbal immediate behaviors that have been validated since the 60s, including smiling and making eye contact and having a relaxed body posture when speaking. Each of these behaviors have pretty consistently shown to increase perceived immediacy between communicators. And they work especially well when it's a supervisor using those nonverbal behaviors to communicate with their employee. A more recently developed set of immediate behaviors are the computer-mediated immediate behaviors. And these are behaviors that you can use in email. So these behaviors include taking the time to type your own name at the bottom of an email, responding promptly to messages, using friendly language, and inviting further communication when needed. Really, these are behaviors in email that show that you took a little bit of extra time and a little bit of extra focus for that particular message. So the difference between letting my signature block sign my name versus writing thanks, Stephanie at the end. It was just that little bit of extra time and effort that results in people feeling more seen and closer to the person who sent the messages. And again, we know from the Dissent literature that these computer-mediated immediate behavior messages are particularly effective when a supervisor wants to establish perceived immediacy with their subordinates. Next slide, please. Now, the last tool in the toolkit is a listening behavior. So there are 3 listening skills that fit into the active empathetic listening model: sensing, processing, and responding. Sensing is the process of listening to where someone actively attends to the verbal and nonverbal components of the message and synthesizes that with the words. So an example of sensing is picking up when someone is being sarcastic rather than responding to what they literally said, also responding to the sarcasm. Processing involves identifying when there's not total clarity in the message and you need some help understanding. So asking for follow-up details to something you just heard is an example of showing a processing listening behavior. And the last one is responding. This is the process in which you demonstrate that you did understand what you hear. And the most common way to do that is to paraphrase. Now, sensing, processing, and responding are all really critical listening skills, but the literature on dissent shows us that responding is the most critical for supervisors, particularly supervisors who want to hear from their subordinates in a dissenting manner. So when supervisors make it a regular habit of paraphrasing what their subordinates have said during one-on-one conversation to make sure they really demonstrate that they've understood their perspective about the workplace, then their subordinates are going to be more likely to dissent later. Next slide, please. So in addition to the toolkit of what to do, let's take a moment to talk about something that research has demonstrated that supervisors shouldn't do, and that's be the workplace comic relief. No doubt, having a workplace environment that's lighthearted and open to humor is good for morale. As Ryan said earlier, you want there to be laughter in the workplace. It's good for people's mental health. But when that constant source of humor is the supervisor, subordinates are more likely to experience burnout in the workplace, and they're less likely to go to the supervisor when they have something important to say. Now, there's some debate in the literature as to why supervisors being that constant source of humor is related to subordinates being burnout. Some scholars think that supervisors who are the workplace clown aren't taken seriously enough to be the person you go to with serious topics. Others think that these people are just a constant source of levity and the subordinates don't want to bring their spirit down, so they feel like they have to handle it on their own to not hurt this person. But whatever the reason, we know that supervisors do best when they support an environment of levity, but they're not that constant source of the humor. This can be a difficult balance to find, and supervisors may need to check in with subordinates through anonymous feedback to get a sense of how they're doing balancing the lighthearted workspace without being the constant source of lightheartedness. But that need to do perception checks is true of each of the communicative tools we've overviewed. Recall that earlier I said that communicative behaviors and other messages are filtered through psychological and emotional variables. It's important to note that all of these communicative tools, like making eye contact, are based on US research. All cultures have their own set of immediate behaviors because different cultures assign different meanings to behaviors. So these suggestions are not going to be true for all people in all places. Likewise, there's not always a one-to-one perfect match between intention and perception. I may, in my classroom, give my students eye contact, trying to establish perceived immediacy. And I will, as long as the students perceive that I'm showing them attention and interest. But if the student perceives that I'm actually staring them down, I'm going to decrease the amount of immediacy they feel. So each of the tools in this toolkit are behaviors that are likely to increase upward dissent, but they're not panacea. They are, however, an excellent place for supervisors to begin refining their communication in hopes that they're going to increase the upward dissent that they see in their workplace. But for some even more practical thoughts, let me turn the presentation over to the next team.
Thank you, Stephanie. So as we've heard from the previous two teams on this session, that there is significant amounts of research about dissent and how helpful it can be. And we wanted to focus our portion of the presentation on what we can do to put all of what we know about dissent into practice. So we were thinking about how to frame it as realizing if we should dissent, when we should do it, and then how to express it. And I'd like to thank Catherine and Carrie for their assistance and their good ideas on this portion of the presentation. So next slide, please. All right, so we thought that the best way to frame the practical aspect of dissent was through Waldron and Cassing's risk negotiation cycle. We thought that this really provided a good way to connect that academic aspect of dissent with the practical element. And according to Waldron and Cassing, there are 4 interconnected phases or stages in the cycle. And overall, the risk negotiation cycle helps employees negotiate risk through these phases, meaning dissent is a risky thing, and organizational members need to think through what really is the risk involved in their dissent. Is it something worthwhile that they need to dissent about? If they do dissent, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be applauded? Are they going to be seen as a villain in the organization? So these are some of the things that we wanted to communicate in this session. But the 4 phases are interconnected. They're dynamic in the sense that people can go through them at different speeds. People can go through the phases in a more linear fashion, or they can actually go back in the phase as well. So the first phase is attending, and that is when organizational members detect that there's something that is going on, there's something that they're thinking about regarding something they disagree with, or something that they want to change. Or in other words, they're acknowledging that there are some individual, relational, and organizational factors that might make it easier for them to dissent, or make it more difficult for them to express their dissent. The second phase is sense making. This is when organizational members explore the meaning and the magnitude of the risk. And it also involves a collective process in which organizational members communicate with and interact with their colleagues, and they arrive at some understanding of what's going on and if dissent is worthwhile and if it's going to make a difference. The third phase is transforming, and this is when organizational members communicatively address and change the risky situations for better or for worse. So in other words, organizational members might emphasize the severity of their work-related dissatisfaction and try to do something about it with the thought that if they express dissent, their ideas for how to improve the workplace might actually result in something good, something positive happening for the organization and its members. Or it might result in something that's less positive, something more negative about the organization. And then there is maintaining. And maintaining occurs when organizational members stabilize the risk level by engaging in actions to keep the risk at a comfortable level. So whenever people are expressing dissent and they feel like they can do it without much repercussion, they're maintaining a certain level in that organizational climate where they can express dissatisfaction and disagreement with the workplace policies and procedures or actions, and nothing bad is really going to happen to them. In fact, it might be a good thing, and that's going to keep being reinforced in the culture of the organization. So next slide, please. So on the next slide here, we wanted to take those phases of the risk negotiation cycle and give people something to think about, something to consider. So you can think of these as some practical wisdom or some tips. So relating to that first phase in the risk negotiation cycle, we advise people to read the situation. Take a look at what's happening in the organization. Realize your level of discomfort with that situation. Is it something that has gotten to the point that you can no longer take it? You can no longer take the status quo? And once you do that, demonstrate your political savvy, as in know who the decision makers are in the organization, know how they're likely to respond to disagreement, know how the coworkers in your organization are likely to respond to your attempts to persuade them to join your cause. So in other words, we're saying, see what's happening in the organization, and then you can proceed from there. And that brings us into sense making. It's a good idea to test dissent messaging with coworkers, especially if they're on board with you, especially if they're seeing the same things you are. Test out the best way to communicate a dissent message to a key decision maker. And also, it's really useful to point out the limitations of logic. Now, our colleagues earlier in our session pointed out that the research points out typically when people use solution presentation or they're using some sort of rationale, good things tend to happen. But sometimes logic fails. Sometimes the best thought out message falls on deaf ears, or it actually results in something bad happening to the organizational member who expressed the dissent. So we advise organizational members to realize the limitations of logic. In the third phase, we advise organizational members to focus on how audience receive dissent, and this relates to that sense-making piece. Consider how people are likely to receive a message about disagreement. Think about if they're going to view it positively, and if they view it positively, can they do something about it? Or are they going to see it as a negative thing, and then they might act out against the person that's expressing dissent? So that relates to B right there. Consider the consequences of expressing dissent, because ideally, expressing dissent is going to result in a positive change, but the possibility exists of negative consequences occurring because of that. And then finally, some wisdom to keep in mind relating to the maintaining phase of the risk negotiation cycle is to acknowledge when no strategy will help. So again, this gets into the point that sometimes there's just limitations to logic. Sometimes you're in a situation where nobody's going to listen to and respond favorably to that dissent. So acknowledge that sometimes, as hard as you try, there's no easy way to change that uncomfortable situation that you find yourself in. And point B here relates to finding your exit strategy in a certain way, like develop your kill criteria, meaning realize when you've tried as much as you can, you've worked on logical messaging, you've tried as well as you possibly could to influence and persuade people to make changes in the organization for the better. And if that fails to happen, tell yourself that you'll move on to another idea. You'll try another strategy, or you might just live with that discomfort for as long as you can before searching out for other opportunities. So putting all of these phases together with the wisdom, we're basically saying, try as hard as you can, use the logic to the extent possible, and see what happens from there. But realize that sometimes dissent can actually work against you. So all of that being said, we want to then give the floor over to Carrie and Katie to talk more about things to keep in mind and some self-reflection to engage in that you can take with you.
Thank you, Michael. I think one of the biggest things, at least in my personal experiences with having dissented in the workplace, the biggest issue I find with dissent is that a lot of people don't really want to hear it. So, you know, innovation that produces better results or improvement in processes or policies can make people at the top look inept, and you know, who really enjoys looking inept, right? So it's kind of a risky endeavor for employees. So it's really super important to consider, you know, when do you want to dissent? What is your threshold for dissenting? So, you know, each individual is going to have a different level depending on their personality, on their organization, on their relationships at work, and how dissent has played out in their organizations previously. But you've got to make sure that you balance, you know, when you dissent with the realities of your organization. So if you dissent, you know, too infrequently, or if that threshold is, you know, maybe too high, you might find yourself in situations where there's unethical or illegal actions, you know, going on around you, and you're still afraid to be able to speak up in those situations. If your threshold's too low, you might complain about every little issue and then be labeled, you know, kind of a troublemaker or a complainer. So I think it's important to keep that in balance. And that's also why it's really critical to focus on what your goal is of dissent. Are you trying to enact real change, or do you just need to vent? Things like that are very important as organizational members try to work through whether or not they want to do this. But in my personal experience, you know, dissent can be very positive and it can have a lot of great impacts in the organization. It just is very situationally specific. And it's really critical to, like Michael was saying, you know, acknowledge when no strategy will help, when logic has been thrown out the window, and you've got to know when you're done, when you're going to initiate those kill criteria and then call it a day, because ultimately, yeah, it can have some very negative consequences for organizational members. And I'll turn it over to Kate.
Yeah, and if we want to switch to the next slide, I think that might help. This is something that we talked about in terms of reflection questions that you might ask yourself, and this handout will be to be distributed after the presentation too, so you can have it as something that you would want to maybe reflect upon. If you ever decide that you might need to or want to dissent at your own workplaces and institutions. And I agree with a lot of what Carrie said about, you know, recognizing the fact, like, yes, dissent is very positive, and we know from all this great research in communication that we do about, you know, these outcomes related to dissent when done effectively. But a lot of the times, unfortunately, I think for those of us or supervisors, I think dissent can be very face-threatening in a way that they don't want to hear it, even if they say that they do. And in a lot of my personal experience, when I've dissented in my life at my various workplaces that I've been at, that's kind of been the case, where there's been a lot of like, okay, yeah, we're willing to hear you out, but then as soon as you do, they're like, never mind. You know, there's they switch it up a little bit. So it's really important in my experiences, of course, to keep considering always, what are the consequences of this dissent? What potentially could be the outcome of it, depending on, you know, what your institution's or organization's threshold for what dissent looks like, and how necessary is it to dissent upwardly versus venting to colleagues, and, you know, taking that approach. The other thing I think is important, and that's highlighted in these reflection questions here, is it thought out, constructive, and solution focused? You're going to be better off if you can provide a, you know, potential solution, or open the door for discussions about potential solutions, rather than just complaining about things. Have I considered like what the impact of that is? Am I presenting it constructively, as you can see on the slide here? Is it solution, or is it just criticizing? Because people are going to respond better to solution focus, because it's less of a face threat to them, because you're not necessarily criticizing them and just only focusing on those negative things, and then eventually that becomes rumination and it just makes everything worse. But ultimately, if you can provide a solution for them, and if you've thought about those solutions, or constructive suggestions, that you might have a little bit of a better shot. And we can go to the last slide here as well. I think there's one more for this, right? Yes. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, of course, is I think in that transforming phase and focusing on, okay, who is my audience and how are they going to receive the dissent? When we teach communication classes across the board, we talk about the importance of knowing our audience. Who are they and what they care about? So do I know how my audience is going to respond? What perspectives do I have about them, about my audience, and if they're going to be receptive of it? And part of that, of course, is going back to the sense-making strategies and, you know, testing dissent with your coworkers. In my experience dissenting at my workplaces, I've relied a lot on the people around me to give me information that maybe I've not considered if I'm making choices about dissent. Giving me those options there to help with that. What risks are involved with the coworkers as well? Because unfortunately, I've been in situations where I might, you know, vocalize things to coworkers and talk about my experiences with dissent, and then they seem on board initially, but then they evaluate their own risks themselves and then back out. So you have to be mindful of who they are as well. And I also think timing is really important too. Is this the right time to be raising concerns, dissent? There's a right time and a wrong time for everything, and that's true for dissent as well. In my own personal experiences, more recently, I've seen that be an issue where maybe there's a change in leadership and we don't like how something's gone, but they're not necessarily going to consider it because they have to figure out, okay, we're a new leader and we're trying to build relationships with faculty, and this is, you know, for organizational members or whoever it might be. Most of us are academics here, so I went for faculty. So knowing what about the timing too, is it right, is it wrong, and what are the consequences of that? But ultimately, it's about keeping in mind, you know, when is this going to be helpful and when is this going to be hurtful? And I think for all of us in our group who have dealt with this, and as we talked about this when we were planning, it all comes back to that. Like, when is it going to be helpful? When is it going to be hurtful? And that's why this risk negotiation model is a good strategy for us when we're taking a practical approach to dissent, to make those decisions about what we're doing.
All right. Wow, that was really, really awesome. Thank you all so much. All the speakers, you were so great. I know that I certainly learned a lot. But now we can begin our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or use the raise hand feature on Zoom. And I will field your excellent questions, and our speakers will give you equally excellent answers. See one in the chat. All right, so Abby is asking, how do you see dissent relating to DEI policies? Great question.
I'm happy to expand on that if you need me to, but
Who wants to take this one? Or do we want Abby to go ahead and expand?
Yeah, I guess I just want to know, like, what do you mean? Like, Do people dissent against them? What happens if they do? Like, I guess I'm just curious about like.
No, I'm thinking the opposite. So I'm teaching a class called, I teach for MBA students. I'm teaching them a class called Communicating DEI in the Workplace.
Mhm.
And so I'm, a lot of the DEI policies are being taken away. And so I'm, I guess sometimes it's more advocating than dissent, but I think nowadays it's sometimes more dissent than advocating because of the ways that they're being taken away. So I'm wondering if you see any overlap, especially with the negotiation literature on needing to sort of negotiate these kinds of policies and negotiate and dissent on these policies being taken away. Maybe I'm not sure, but I see some overlap and I'm wondering if you've seen any as well.
Well, I can offer some thoughts. I'll step out of my moderator role for just a second on this, and if any of the speakers want to add on to my thoughts, that's great too. I think any policy is a double-edged sword. I'm certainly not in favor of all these DEI policies being taken away necessarily, because I do think when you have policies, that is a good accountability tool that can be sort of used to inform a dissent message. But at the same time, I also think, DEI issues in general are so nuanced, and a lot of modern day forms of harassment, discrimination, etc., kind of fall outside the bounds of those policies. So sometimes the policies themselves can be a constraint of the decision makers, like some of our awesome speakers talked about earlier. Um, so I think that's something important to acknowledge. But yeah, does anyone else want to add on to that? I'll give you all some time to think, and we'll circle back to that one because we have two sort of related questions in the chat right now that I think are for our third team. And one asks Michael specifically, if you have a kill option in mind when engaging in dissent, does that impact how you might engage in the process? Do you have background information that might be persuasive because you want to keep the options open? And Tafweek would also like to know if you have any suggestions on killing the strategy and how to, like, what those kill criteria might be after all else fails.
Yeah, great questions. I had a feeling that the practical wisdom about developing a kill criteria might spark some conversation. So I'm happy to have these questions. And I'll answer Laurel's question first. Yeah, I have a kill option in mind when I realize that the person that I'm expressing dissent to over a period of time is unwilling to listen to logic and listen to reason, and is no longer really worth my emotional and cognitive energy to keep up with it. And so it really becomes an issue of me knowing what's ultimately best for myself and thinking that the status quo might actually be uncomfortable, but I can live with it for a little while longer until another idea springs to mind, or there might be some other change that eventually occurs, especially in higher education where it seems like a lot of things change pretty frequently. So sometimes we can just wait things out. And then for the other question, do you have suggestions on killing strategy after all else fails? I think realizing when it's a hindrance to you to continue fighting the battle and continuing to waste your energy on something that might never happen, despite your best effort, despite all the upward influence strategies that you can think of. I think it comes back to personally, what are you willing to sacrifice about yourself in order to win an argument or to achieve the change that you want to see?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. Great response. Anyone else have anything to add or any other questions.
I also think going along with that, I think a strategy of dissent is knowing when to pick your battles and what ones are worth pressing and what ones are not. And you can start to evaluate that when you're starting to consider who is my audience and how are they going to respond to me, and you're looking at the risks. It's like, okay, I've picked this battle and I'm going to argue, but how committed are you to sticking with it when things maybe aren't going your way, when you realize like logic isn't going to work here and they don't want to hear it, maybe because it's face threatening or whatever it might be. I think part of it is assessing like for kill criteria. How committed are you, and when are some specific thresholds where you might need to just abort mission and save and do something else?
I think to add to what Katie said, yes, yeah, exactly. You've got to pick your battles with dissent, and if you're going to go all in and not have a point of, or it's something you really cannot live with, that it's something that you just can't stand for, you might have to be ready to leave the organization. I know that was an experience I personally had where it was just not going to work between me and a particular supervisor, and it came down to that. And I had worked at that place for almost a decade, so you need to really understand the potential consequences if you get into a situation in which you've gone too far down that road and there's really no turning back, or it's an issue that you just can't live with.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. We have another question in the chat, and I think this is maybe for some of our earlier speakers, perhaps, which is great. We're mixing it up. What are the relationships between and the similarities and differences in workplace dissent research being done by communication scholars versus maybe like business scholars?
Maybe I can speak to that as well as I'm able. There is some terrific research about dissent in business and management. I think they tend to use slightly different language. For example, Elizabeth Morrison is just towering scholar here, and they tend to organize this literature under the word of voice, employee voice. And it actually is a bit bigger of a concept, but it's adjacent enough. And so that would be a great place to go. Morrison is a good one to commend to you there. There's also interesting language called issue selling in the workplace, and from a management perspective, and that is a lot like what we're describing. Issue selling, especially upward issue selling or issue crafting, is the idea that we get an issue in mind that we would like to see changed, and we package it in language that we think would be palatable or persuasive to top level decision makers. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to go look that way. However, sense making theory tends to be underneath both, used by kind of both sets of scholars, and that's important. Hopefully, one way that this might be different, I do think that in organizational communication, we tend to have a sense of self-consciousness not to necessarily serve management's purposes if we do find, but we don't necessarily have that value that we need to follow, and so that's sometimes referred to as managerialism. That we try to avoid accusations of managerialism in organizational communication. So there's just a couple thoughts for you. I'm happy to elaborate if you like some more.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah. I agree with everything Ryan said. And I would add that if you look at the business literature in the last 5 years, you're seeing that more and more they're starting to take from communication.
Yes, I totally agree.
The business literature is all about business analytics right now. And you cannot pick up a business analytics textbook that does not say that the end goal of all analytics and data in business is good communication. And so we're starting to see a lot of collaboration between communication and business now. I anticipate it's going to look more and more like that over time, as finally, we're seeing the business literature accept that communication is part of every business. And if you don't have your communication in check, you can't have your business in check.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thanks so much for adding on to that. Next question. If downward dissent happens and causes a negative atmosphere, what would be a strategy to sort of re-promote upward dissent?
Oh,
So one strategy that can work as long as it's handled well is beginning a process of anonymous dissent, anonymous feedback. So opportunities to fill out surveys or voice cards, but the key there is being transparent with the data, because if employees don't get to see what the data said, even if you have to redact some of the identifying comments, they have no way of knowing that the data actually said what you were conveying to them instead. And they need to see change based on that feedback. And if that's not handled well the first time and two, then people are going to stop giving that feedback because they don't have a reason to believe that it's worth their time.
I think I will add to that. I think it is very important. Again, I think Garner said something, viewing dissent as a process, because it's not one-time event, and people will evaluate the manager based on how the past dissenters and messages have been accommodated. So you want to rebuild that atmosphere. It's going to take time. Understanding it's going to be difficult, but set some of the good examples to start with, and you're going to win people's trust over time.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Another really good question. Has dissent scholarship looked into any differences, connections, etc., between dissentive groups from blue collar or versus white collar workplaces?
I can't recall any literature on that. That's a great question. Has anyone else read?
No, I am aware of a case study involving, yes, I'm aware of a case study involving a chicken processing plant. And this particular organization that'll remain unnamed, but is probably in your freezer, was using, they were hiring clergy, as a matter of fact, for, I don't know, 10 hours a week. Because they had realized that a lot of the people who worked there had a kind of an understanding that it was a cultural, in fact, a religious kind of understanding that they brought with them, that if you speak up to power holders, you do so through an intermediary. And so the company's solution was to hire clergy, basically to be somebody who could hear dissent and then in turn report that while protecting the identity of the dissenter. So some interesting points there. And I need to find, maybe I can find that dissertation for you if I looked. But what a great topic. If somebody were to take that on, I'd like it. Yeah.
There's a article about, I'm trying to remember the journal now. It's called The Factory That Time Forgot, that I love by Etel, and it's all about a factory in the UK where the employees kind of engage in resistance based on co-opting the language of empowerment because of all the self-directed work team literature that they had been kind of abandoned for a while, and all the literature that's often used for to encourage upward or feedback and empowerment for white collar workers. They kind of co-opted that language to say, yeah, we don't want to be in charge. We want you to do the work. And so they resisted managerial attempts to kind of downsize and get rid of certain perks and things because they were empowered to say, no, we'd rather have you do it. And the idea is, no, you're supposed to want to be empowered to speak up, and voice and everything is supposed to be so that you can take ownership. And they said, well, we're using our voice to say, nah, we don't want to. And it was a really interesting piece, but it's called The Factory That Time Forgot. And it's not comparing white and blue collar, but it is talking about using kind of white collar empowerment or participation strategies when used in a blue collar setting, how it kind of created an interesting culture clash and problems managerially.
So interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. Mary is asking, has dissent scholarship looked into generational differences in the workplace?
I'm not aware of any other panelists before I say more about that. I'm not directly aware of that, or anybody else. So in some of our studies, we will collect age. So it's not, we do it more continuous in terms of variable as the category of generation. And one of the things we very consistently find is that younger, or the less the work experience, the more polite and indirect the dissent, even about ethical issues. And so take that as you will, but I think it does make a lot of sense, because there's maybe even that underlying fear is greatest at that point, where they question themselves. If they don't have a lot of work experience yet, maybe I'm naive to it, or maybe I'll be seen as naive, maybe I'll be seen as incompetent, especially given my lack of prior credibility in my age. So that's some stuff that we very consistently see. Statistically speaking, it pops real easily. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll also just add, there is a piece by, I believe his name is David Burr. He's at Yale, on an intergroup perspective on dissent. It doesn't get into any specific demographic categories or anything like that specifically, but it does outline a set of principles that about dissent when there's like sort of a salient group difference, such as age, that is relevant to the dissenting situation. So you might find that helpful as well. That was published in 2011, and it is titled An Intergroup Perspective on Dissent. And again, the last name on that author is Berg, B-E-R-G. Priscilla is also asking, has organizational dissent scholarship established factors that account for how organizational leaders react to dissent? Feel like this question maybe gets at a little bit of what we were talking about with how these different upward dissent strategies are perceived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of like a personality study, but I bet there is one that will give us something about the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeables, neuroticism, and stuff like that here. But I would say that there's like great research about people's implicit theory of self, or implicit theory of intelligence. And when supervisors believe that intelligence is fixed at birth, they tends to make them much more defensive about dissent. And you can see a summary of that research in Mary Murphy's recent book called Cultures of Growth. Mary Murphy, Cultures of Growth.
Awesome.
There's
Thank
also
you.
some work by Stephen Croucher that looks at macro cultures and organizational cultures and how they relate, and how one's macro culture is going to influence what they think a normal workplace is going to look like, and therefore influence what a leader is supposed to look like, especially in terms of power distance. So he has some really interesting study looking at norms of a culture in terms of power distance and how that affects how dissent is handled in a workplace.
And I know Casting has some research from around the mid-2000s about how the upward dissent messages were viewed in terms of competence.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I actually had a question as well. We've had a great conversation about like realizing when like dissent might not work, even if we, craft the most like perfect, competent, pro-social message out there. And one sort of limitation to dissent that I've encountered in my own personal dissenting experience that really surprised me was what you were all talking about with the limitations of logic. And I'm just wondering, like, what are maybe some red flags that might prompt someone who's thinking about dissenting to identify some of these limitations of logic, or, realize, when that is the reason that the dissent will likely not be successful.
I mean, I guess in my personal experience, the personality factors of who you're dissenting to. So especially if it's an upward dissent. So like the dark triad, if you recognize any of those factors, like proceed with caution. If you've seen other people dissent and it has gone poorly, or the stories are not positive, use those warnings to influence, or, your decisions on whether or how hard you're going to press an issue. But yeah, I think those are the biggest things is, yeah, I mean, who you're dissenting to and how they're going to react to it. I think it's based on their personality, and then also the organizational situation that they're in at that point in time. So if they're under a lot of pressure and you don't understand the constraints or the pressure they're under, you might be asking them something that they can't do, or that they're unwilling to do at that time. And so I think trying to come to it from a place of understanding, what might their constraints be, and helping me address this problem and trying to view it that way might help. But ultimately, yeah, there's so many factors within the organization that you don't see, especially if you're not in a management or a leadership position.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I really appreciate those comments, and very reasonable set of comments. I might just jam there a little bit too in terms of the limits of logic. One thing that comes up in our research about ethical dissent, we almost always focus exclusively on ethical dissent and aspirations, concerns and aspirations. We've discovered that if the conversation unfolds like, I think this is unethical, or is this unethical, it becomes this kind of lawyery logic game of figuring out that line of ethical versus unethical. So it becomes very like verbally dense and reasoning based. But with a slight change on that, if this dissent says, I don't know if this is unethical, but I don't feel great about it. It doesn't seem like in line with what my highest ideals. So if the conversation is moved up there, which is like, this doesn't feel like something that's in line with my integrity or my highest ideals, it might well not be unethical, but it still isn't at the point where, okay, it still is implying we need change. And so it is an interesting strategy, upward strategy, especially sort of associated with ethics, or maybe even issues that we've discussed, which have ethical implications, to keep us away from like a hyper philosophical discussion around that line of ethical, unethical. You say, but what is it? Is it ethically excellent? You get the whole conversation up higher, and it makes I think a richer conversation beyond just like this hardcore logic wrangling the connector.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to all of our incredible speakers for sharing your expertise and perspectives today. I'd also like to thank the audience for attending and engaging in this important conversation.